Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that. If you're returning, how you doing? What we're going to talk about today is a little bit of a history lesson, all right? And this is about the bank holiday of 1933. Now, this bank holiday of 1933 is kind of, sort of, a little reminiscent of what we're going through right now. Okay, so just listen to what this is all about. All right, now for an entire week in March of 1933, all banking transactions were suspended in an effort to stem bank failures and ultimately restore confidence in the financial system. Now, I realize that we have not had this yet, but it almost seems as if this could be in the works because of all the bank failures right now. Okay. At 1 a.m. on Monday, March 6th, President Roosevelt issued Proclamation 2039, ordering the suspension of all banking transactions effective immediately. He had taken the oath of office only 36 hours earlier. The terms of the presidential proclamation specified that no such banking institution or branch shall pay out, export, earmark, or permit the withdrawal or transfer in any manner or by any device whatsoever of any gold or silver coin or bullion or currency, or take any other action which might facilitate the hoarding thereof, nor shall any such banking institution or branch pay out deposits, make loans or discounts, deal in foreign exchange, transfer credits from the United States to any place abroad, or transact any other banking business whatsoever. For an entire week, Americans would have no access to banks or banking services. They could not withdraw or transfer their money, nor could they make deposits. Now, this crisis had been a long time coming. In the 3 years leading up to it, thousands of banks had failed. But a new round of problems that began in early 1933 placed a severe strain on New York banks, many of which held balances for banks in other parts of the country. The head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and Federal Reserve Board governor were pivotal figures in the bank holiday. On March 1st, 1933, George Harrison, who was the Federal Reserve Bank, the head of the Federal Reserve Bank, sent an urgent message to MIRA, who was the Federal Reserve Board governor, and Secretary of the Treasury, Ogden Mills. The New York Reserve Bank's gold reserve had fallen below the legal limit. Reserve banks were required to maintain gold reserves equal to 40% of the paper currency that they issued. But foreign domestic holders of U.S. currency were rapidly losing faith in paper money and were redeeming dollars at an alarming rate. Harrison's communique to Washington bluntly stated that he would no longer take responsibility for running the New York Reserve Bank with deficient reserves. When the Federal Reserve Board responded that it was reluctantly considering a 30-day suspension of the legal gold reserve requirements, Harrison pointed out that a suspension of the requirements would not stem the outflow of gold. In his view, the best course would be to declare a national bank holiday that would permit the country to calm down and allow time for the enactment of remedial legislation. But the initiative in declaring a bank holiday could only come from President Hoover, who was refusing to meet the Treasury Secretary Mills and Governor Meyer. The pair, Mills and Meyer, on being blocked at the White House door, returned to Harrison with suggestion that he ask Herbert Lyman, Lehman, who had succeeded President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt as governor of New York, to declare a bank holiday in that state. And Harrison rejected the suggestion, saying that even if Lyman agreed to the request, the New York Federal Reserve Bank would still have to pay out gold to foreigners. Besides, to halt all banking operations in New York, the nation's financial center, would make it impossible for the banking system to function in the rest of the United States. A number of New York's most prominent bankers also opposed the statewide bank holiday on the grounds that it would hurt their prestige. In a meeting with the New York governor, Lyman, they declared that they would rather stay open and take their beating. On March 3rd, however, the mounting toll of bank closures and failures had forced bankers and their regulators to recognize their need for decisive action. The directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York adopted a resolution requesting that the Federal Reserve Board urge President Hoover to proclaim a nationwide bank holiday. The New York Fed's Harrison reversed his opposition to a statewide bank holiday, and representatives of the clearinghouse banks of New York followed with a qualified endorsement of the proposal, provided the records show that they neither sought nor directly requested the action. On the following day, Saturday, March 4th, all 12 Federal Reserve banks kept their doors locked, and banks in 37 states either closed completely or operated under state-imposed restrictions on withdrawals. All that remained was for the president to order a nationwide bank holiday, but neither Hoover nor President-elect Roosevelt appeared willing to take the next step. Roosevelt's advisors, who had no clearly defined strategy of their own for dealing with a banking crisis, seemed content to remain vague until their boss moved into the White House. Expectations ran high on March 4th, 1933, as Roosevelt stepped to the podium to deliver his inaugural address. Although the address was short on specifics, Roosevelt identified two immediate objectives: getting people back to work and strict supervision of all banking and credits and investments. The following day, cabinet members joined with Treasury and Federal Reserve officials to lay the groundwork for a national bank holiday, and at 1 a.m. on Monday, March 6, Roosevelt issued a proclamation ordering the suspension of all banking transactions effective immediately. It was based on drafts originally prepared for Hoover by Treasury and Federal Reserve Board officials. The nationwide bank holiday was to extend through Thursday, March 9th, at which time Congress would convene an extraordinary session to consider emergency legislation aimed at restoring public confidence in the financial system. Meanwhile, everyone else tried to deal with the reality that all banks were to remain closed until further notice. People had no way of knowing when or if they would ever see their money again. Yet, for the most part, there were surprising little panic. An article in the Boston Post noted this: everyone seemed to take the bank closing with good nature. Police officers on duty at the banks with instructions to inform any prospective depositors just why they could not leave their money reported that there was little or no excitement because the doors of the bank were not open. There seemed to be few who appeared for the purpose of withdrawing cash, the officer said, and many thought it was a great joke that they were unable to get to the banks for the purpose of making deposits. According to the Associated Press, they reported this: the average citizen's chief trouble appeared to lie in difficulty of cashing paychecks. Stores generally extended credit more liberally for household necessities. Money orders were generally limited to $100. One company paid 25% for incoming money orders and gave checks for the balances. Railroad companies took emergency action, announcing broadened credit and stated that travelers would not be left stranded anywhere because of banking difficulties. Now, across America, people did their best to cope with the banking closings. Milwaukee ministers agreed not to pass collection plates until the crisis was over, and the First Baptist Church of El Paso, Texas, arranged to accept IOUs. Pushcart peddlers in Boston wouldn't hand over their fruits and vegetables to customers who tried to pay with large bills. In Bronx traffic court, 28 law violators served one-day sentences rather than having to pay out cash for fines of $2 to $5. An ad for Pebeco toothpaste declared that to back our faith in the current emergency program, we stand ready to keep millions of American families supplied with toothpaste. Get 3 tubes. Take 3 months to pay. The governor of California gave a reprieve to condemned murderer Peter Farrington because of the doubtful legality of hanging on a holiday. Wow. There was, however, no reprieve for those who owed federal income tax. The IRS was perfectly willing to accept checks, of course. Back in Washington, government officials and congressional leaders continued to grapple with the task of reopening the banks. One of their greatest challenges was finding a way to prevent reopened banks from failing. They accomplished this by hammering out a proposal to reopen the banks in stages. Class A banks were solvent institutions in little or no danger of failing. Class B banks were endangered, weakened, or insolvent institutions that were thought to be capable of reopening after an indefinite period of reorganization. Class C banks were insolvent institutions that would not be allowed to reopen. The Federal Reserve banks sent the Treasury list of banks recommended for reopening, and the Treasury licensed those it approved. Congress would eventually incorporate much of this proposal into the Emergency Banking Act. But before banks could reopen, there also needed to be agreement on whether or not to weaken the link between gold and note issue. At one point, Treasury officials seriously considered issuing large amounts of government scrip as an emergency substitute to take the place of cash. They even went as far as to print $10 million worth. But in the end, Treasury Secretary William Woodin, W-O-O-D-I-N, backed away from the plan, primarily out of concern that the public would not accept scrip, and that's S-C-R-I-P, at face value. Where would we be, he said, if we had IOUs, scrip, and certificates floating all around the country? Now, he's right. Instead, he decided to issue currency against the sound assets of the banks, as opposed to issuing currency against gold. The Federal Reserve Act lets us print all we'll need, and it won't frighten the people. It won't look like stage money. It'll be money that looks like real money. The Federal Reserve would have greater authority to support banks that reopened by lending more freely against the sound assets of those banks. In George Harrison's view, the Federal Reserve banks would become, in effect, guarantors of the deposits of reopened banks. The crisis began to subdue on March 9th, when Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act. On March 13th, only 4 days later, after the emergency legislation went into effect, member banks in Federal Reserve cities received permission to reopen. By March 15th, banks controlling 90% of the country's banking resources had resumed operations, and deposits far exceeded withdrawals. Although some 4,000 banks would remain closed forever and full economic recovery was still years in the future, the worst of the banking crisis seemed to be over. So that's just a little history lesson that's just might repeat itself. I don't know. All right, guys, that's over. That's all for this video. All right, I will see you in the next one. You stay safe, you stay positive, you keep prepping, and as always, fear less. Ciao.